History says Vikings loved swords. Wrong. Another weapon killed faster, struck harder, and terrified enemies more than any blade. Vikings used it to conquer half of Europe. Kings outlawed it by name. Churches condemned it as the devil's tool. But what made it so feared? Don't miss the final reveal. How could a weapon so effective, so devastating, and so uniquely Viking be erased from warfare almost entirely? That is the question military historians still debate today. The answer is both brutal and brilliant. Picture this. The year is 1066. An English army marches north to face Norwegian invaders. They expect swords, they expect spears, they expect shields. What they don't expect is the carnage that awaits them. Chronicles from that era describe something different, something that made seasoned soldiers freeze in terror. A weapon that could split a man from shoulder to hip in one swing. A weapon that made armour feel like parchment. A weapon so effective that within 200 years, European nobility would ban it from honourable combat. Not because it was cowardly, not because it was dishonourable in the traditional sense, but because it was too good, too deadly, too efficient at ending lives. Medieval laws specifically mention this weapon by description. Battle manuals warn against facing warriors who carry it. Religious texts call it a tool of pagans and demons. Yet for over 4 centuries this weapon shaped the fate of kingdoms. It decided who lived and who died. It determined which villages burned and which survived. It carved the Viking legacy into European soil with blood and fear. And here's what makes this story truly fascinating. While modern movies show Vikings with gleaming swords worth a king's ransom, the real weapon of choice cost almost nothing to make. A farmer could craft one, a blacksmith could forge the blade in a day. There was no secret metallurgy, no rare materials, no mystical forging techniques passed down through generations. Just simple physics, devastating leverage, and Viking ingenuity. This weapon turned ordinary men into killing machines. It gave raiders an advantage that terrified professional soldiers. It made the Viking Age possible. So why don't we talk about it? Why did it vanish? Why did the sword steal all the glory? The truth is more political than practical, more cultural than tactical, and it starts with understanding what this weapon actually was and why it worked so devastatingly well. For centuries, this weapon decided battles across Scandinavia and beyond. Viking raids from 793 CE onward relied on it. English chronicles describe it cutting through armour like cloth. Frankish soldiers feared it more than fire. Irish monks wrote prayers specifically asking God for protection against it. This wasn't just a weapon, it was psychological warfare. When Viking longships appeared on the horizon, defenders knew what was coming. Not just violence, not just death, but a specific kind of brutality that this weapon delivered with mechanical efficiency. The Battle of Maldon in 991 CE provides our first detailed account. An Anglo-Saxon poem describes Viking warriors wielding these weapons with devastating effect. They didn't just fight, they demolished. Shield walls that should have held for hours collapsed in minutes. Armoured thanes who trained their entire lives died like children. The poem uses a specific Old English word repeatedly. Hedogrim. Battle fierce. Battle grim. But the literal translation is even more chilling. Savage in war. And what made it truly unstoppable? It required no noble birth to master. A sword demanded years of training, precise footwork, perfect balance, muscle memory developed through childhood. But this weapon? A strong farmer could learn it in months. The movements were natural. Swing, hook, strike, pull. The physics did the work. Your enemy's armour became irrelevant. Their shield became a liability. Their sword couldn't reach you. Training manuals from the 9th century show techniques that seem almost unfair. How to hook a shield and yank it down. How to strike past a sword guard. How to use reach to control distance. How to spin the weapon for maximum momentum. These weren't desperate tactics. This was systematic battlefield dominance. Historical accounts from Francia describe Viking raids where local militias simply fled rather than face these weapons. Not because the Vikings outnumbered them, not because they lacked courage, but because experience taught them a brutal lesson. Fighting Vikings with these weapons meant death. Running meant survival. The choice was simple. In fact, Frankish chronicles from the 800s and 30s specifically mention commanders refusing to engage Viking forces in open battle. They retreated to fortifications, they paid tribute, they negotiated. anything to avoid facing these weapons in the field. This pattern repeated across Europe, from Ireland to the Mediterranean, from England to the Baltic. Wherever Vikings raided, this weapon preceded their reputation. Local blacksmiths tried to copy it. They failed. Not because the design was complicated, but because Viking warriors had developed techniques, grips, and battlefield tactics over generations. The weapon wasn't just iron and wood, it was culture, it was identity, it was Viking, and it was about to change medieval warfare forever. So what exactly was this feared weapon? The weapon was called the Dane axe. To Vikings it was bradox, broad axe. To terrified English monks it was the heathen's scythe. To Frankish soldiers it was la hache danoise, the Danish horror. But across medieval Europe for 400 years, this weapon was respected, feared, and whispered about as the Widowmaker. The Dane axe wasn't your typical hand axe. It wasn't the small tool Vikings used to chop wood or build longships. This was something entirely different, something purpose-built for one thing only: killing. The design was deceptively simple: a long wooden haft, typically ash or oak, measuring 4 to 6 feet in length. At the end, a razor-sharp crescent blade spanning 8 to 12 inches across. But here's what made it revolutionary. The blade was thin, incredibly thin. Archaeological finds from burial sites in Norway and Denmark show blades barely thicker than modern machetes. Some measure just 2 to 3 millimeters at the cutting edge. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional engineering. A thin blade meant less weight at the end of a long pole. Less weight meant faster swings. Faster swings meant more strikes per minute. More strikes meant more dead enemies. Simple physics turned into battlefield mathematics. The haft length gave it reach that swords couldn't match. A Viking wielding a Dane axe could strike from 6 feet away. A swordsman had to close to 3 feet. That 3-foot difference meant life or death. It meant striking first. It meant controlling the fight. It meant the swordsman died before his blade ever reached Viking flesh. The blade shape was equally calculated, not a simple wedge like a woodcutting axe. The edge curved in a graceful crescent, sometimes called a bearded blade because the lower portion extended downward like a beard. This wasn't decoration. The extended lower edge allowed the wielder to hook and pull, to grab shield rims, to catch weapon shafts, to yank enemies off balance before delivering the killing blow. Archaeological evidence shows these axes were works of art. Pattern-welded steel, forged in layers. Some blades show silver inlay, decorative patterns, runic inscriptions. These weren't crude tools. They were prized possessions, family heirlooms, symbols of status. A warrior's Dane axe was buried with him because it represented his identity, his kills, his honour, his Viking soul. Museums across Scandinavia display dozens of these weapons. The British Museum, the National Museum of Denmark, the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo. Each one tells the same story: craftsmanship, lethality, pride. These weren't mass-produced weapons for disposable soldiers. Each Dane axe was individual, personal, deadly, and the Vikings who wielded them, they were specialists, elite warriors, huskarlar, the household troops of kings and jarls, men who trained specifically with this weapon, men who made it an extension of their bodies, men who turned simple physics into an art form of death. Unlike swords, which required years of training, a Dane axe could be mastered in months. But mastery meant understanding the physics, and the physics were terrifying. A sword strike delivers perhaps 200 joules of energy. That's enough to cut flesh, enough to pierce leather, maybe enough to dent chainmail if you're lucky and strong. But a Dane axe swing, over 400 joules. Some estimates go as high as 600 joules with a full power overhead strike, enough to crack helmets, enough to split mail armour, enough to shatter bones through padding. The difference wasn't just strength, it was leverage, basic physics. Force equals mass times acceleration, but with a lever, you multiply that force exponentially. A 6-foot haft acted as a force multiplier. The axe head travelled in a wide arc. By the time it reached the target, it was moving at speeds a sword could never achieve. Modern physicists have calculated the tip velocity of a Dane axe swing at over 100 miles per hour. That's faster than a Major League fastball, faster than most car crashes, and all that speed concentrated into a blade edge measuring millimeters thick. The pressure per square inch was astronomical. Steel armour designed to deflect swords simply failed against this kind of focused impact. Archaeological evidence proves this devastation. Mass graves from Viking-era battles tell a horrific story. Skulls show clean splits from crown to jaw, vertebrae severed in single strikes, shoulder bones cleaved completely through, pelvic bones cracked by downward blows. These weren't injuries from prolonged combat. These were instant kills, one strike, one death. Forensic analysis from the University of Cambridge examined remains from the St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002 CE. The skeletal trauma showed a consistent pattern. Deep clean cuts, massive force trauma, injuries consistent with large-bladed weapons swung with extreme velocity, the Dane axe. But raw power was only half the story. The real genius was the hook. That extended lower blade created a secondary weapon. While your enemy focused on the axe edge, the hook did something more insidious. It grabbed. Medieval combat relied on shields. A good shield could stop swords, deflect spears, and save your life dozens of times in a single battle. But against a Dane axe, your shield became a liability. The hook caught the shield rim. A sharp pull downward and suddenly your shield was at your knees, your torso exposed, your neck vulnerable. The killing blow came before you could recover. Combat manuscripts from the 13th century specifically warn about this technique. They call it the Vikings trap. Historical accounts describe it repeatedly. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 provides the most famous example. A single Viking axeman held a narrow bridge against the entire English army, not with strength alone, not with courage alone, but with technique. He hooked shields, he controlled distance, he used the bridge's width to prevent flanking. Chronicles say he killed 40 men before an English soldier floated under the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear through the planks. 40 trained soldiers, one man, one Dane axe. That's not legend, that's physics, leverage, reach, and Viking expertise turned into historical fact. The weapon didn't just kill, it dominated space, it controlled combat, it made individual Vikings worth 10 ordinary soldiers, and Europe was about to learn that lesson in blood. Sagas describe warriors spinning them overhead, hooking shields and striking from impossible angles. One swing could decapitate a horse, 2 swings could collapse a shield wall. These weren't exaggerations written by poets trying to glorify their ancestors. These were tactical realities that changed how medieval warfare functioned. The Heimskringla saga describes King Olaf Haraldsson's Huskarlar at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030 CE. His axe-wielding bodyguards formed a circle around him. Enemies charged with swords and spears. The axes swung in coordinated arcs. The saga uses a specific phrase. The iron sang in the air. Within minutes, the ground was littered with bodies, severed limbs, broken shields, shattered weapons. The Norwegian army was losing the battle, but the Dane axes created a zone of death no one could penetrate. Olaf died that day, but not from frontal assault. An enemy had to climb rocks behind him and strike from above, because facing his axeman from the front meant certain death. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle provides another chilling account. The Battle of Ashington in 1016 CE, King Knut's Danes faced King Edmund Ironside's English. The Chronicle describes the Danish front line, tall men, long weapons, crescent blades gleaming. The English shield wall advanced confidently. They had numbers, they had position, they had God on their side, the Danes had axes. The Chronicle records what happened next with unusual specificity. The axes fell like hail, the shields split like dry wood. The brave men of Essex died where they stood. The English lost over 6,000 men that day, not in a rout, not in a retreat, standing in formation, because retreating from Dane axes meant exposing your back, and that meant death even faster. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect wasn't the killing power, it was the versatility. A sword has one function: stab, slash, maybe pommel strike if you're desperate. A spear has one range: keep distance, thrust, hope your enemy doesn't close. The Dane axe, it had options. At long range, use the reach advantage. Swing in wide arcs, keep multiple enemies at bay, control space. At medium range, use the hook, grab shields, yank weapons, pull enemies off balance, trip cavalry. At close range, reverse grip. Use the haft as a staff. Strike with the back spike some axes featured. Choke up on the handle for quick strikes. And if your enemy somehow got inside your range, the axe became a lever. Hook their leg, sweep them to the ground, finish with a downward strike, no wasted movement, no panic, just systematic problem solving that ended with your enemy dead. Irish annals from the 9th century describe this versatility with genuine fear. The Annals of Ulster mention Vikings who could fight on foot or horseback with equal skill using these weapons. They describe axes cutting through monastery doors, through leather armour, through wooden fortifications, through anything the Irish could hide behind. One entry from 837 CE simply states, "The heathens with their long axes destroyed everything." Everything! That's not poetic language. That's traumatized monks trying to describe something they had no context for. European warfare before Vikings was relatively standardized. Swords for nobility, spears for infantry, shields for defense, predictable, controllable, survivable if you knew the rules. The Dane axe broke the rules, it made expensive armor worthless, it made shield walls collapse, it made numerical advantage less important, it made Viking raiders punch far above their weight. 100 Vikings with Dane axes could defeat 300 local militiamen, not through berserker rage, not through reckless courage, through simple mechanical advantage and superior training. And medieval Europe had no answer for it. No counter-tactic, no defensive formation, nothing worked. So they did what humans always do when they can't defeat something. They tried to make it illegal. Yet by the 1200s, European laws specifically banned its use in combat. Not all combat, not peasant brawls, not self-defense, specifically honourable combat, judicial duels, tournaments, knightly warfare. The weapon that had dominated battlefields for 4 centuries was suddenly beneath dignity, unworthy of civilised men, a tool of savages. How did this happen? 3 forces converged to erase the Dane axe from history: Christianity, feudalism, and technological change. Each one chipped away at the weapon's legitimacy until it vanished almost completely. First came the Church. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia after 1000 CE, missionaries encountered a problem. Viking warriors associated the Dane axe with Odin, with berserkers, with pagan battle rituals. Sagas describe warriors consecrating their axes with blood before battle, praying to the old gods for strength, entering trance states and fighting with superhuman ferocity. The Church called this demonic possession, witchcraft, heretical worship. Papal decrees from the 11th century specifically mention long axes as instruments of pagan violence. Bishops preached that Christian warriors should use Christian weapons. The sword became holy. The cross and blade merged symbolically. Knights blessed their swords. Saints were depicted with swords. The sword represented divine justice. The axe represented everything Christianity opposed: savage paganism, uncontrolled violence, refusal to submit to God's order. By 1150, carrying a Dane axe in many Christian kingdoms marked you as suspect, possibly heretic, definitely uncivilized. But religion alone didn't kill the Dane axe. Feudalism did its part. Medieval society was rebuilding itself around strict hierarchies: kings, lords, knights, peasants. Everyone in their place, everyone with their role, and weapons became symbols of social status. A sword cost a fortune. The steel alone required master smiths, months of work, specialised knowledge. Only nobility could afford real swords, which made swords exclusive, noble, worthy. An axe? Any blacksmith could make one. Any farmer could afford one. Worse, any peasant with an axe could potentially kill a knight. That was intolerable, not because it was impossible, but because it was too possible. Feudalism required peasants to believe in noble superiority, to accept that knights were superior warriors blessed by God and blood. But if a farmer with a cheap axe could split a knight's helmet, that illusion shattered. So laws emerged. In England, the Assize of Arms in 1181 regulated who could own what weapons. Long axes weren't banned outright, but their use in formal combat was restricted. In France, similar laws appeared. Tournament regulations specifically excluded axes from knightly competition. You could joust with lances, duel with swords, but axes, that was peasant work, dishonourable, beneath chivalric dignity. By 1250, the cultural transformation was complete. Young nobles trained exclusively with swords. Military manuals focused on sword technique. Romantic poetry celebrated the sword. The axe became associated with executioners and woodcutters. The weapon that had conquered Europe was now a symbol of low birth. And then came the final blow: technological change. Plate armour emerged in the 1300s. full suits of articulated steel, joints protected, weak points minimised. This armour changed everything. Cutting weapons became less effective. A Dane axe could still crack a helmet, still break bones through armour, but it couldn't pierce the way swords could thrust between armour plates. Knights adapted, they developed specialised techniques, half-swording, murder strokes, grappling, finding gaps in armour and exploiting them. Swords evolved, tapered points for thrusting, stiffened blades for penetration. The Dane axe, it didn't evolve. Its design was perfect for the warfare of 800 to 1200 CE. But warfare had moved on. Within 3 centuries, the weapon that shaped the Viking Age existed only in church carvings and fading memories. Museums collected a few examples, historians noted them briefly. But the techniques, the training, the battlefield dominance, lost, erased, forgotten. The sword had won, not through superiority, through politics, through culture, through the systematic rewriting of history by those who feared what the axe represented. Raw effectiveness, egalitarian lethality, the terrifying idea that a common man with the right tool could kill his betters. But modern tests prove its lethality. Researchers at the University of Oslo recreated authentic Dane axes and tested them against period armour. They used historical metallurgy techniques, forged blades matching museum specimens, crafted hafts from proper wood with correct dimensions. Then they built targets, chainmail hauberks, leather gambesons, wooden shields reinforced with iron, helmets matching 10th century designs, everything accurate to the period. The results shocked even the researchers. The Dane axe cleaved through chainmail in one strike, not damaged it, not bent the rings, cleaved completely through. The blade passed through mail, through the padding underneath, and into the ballistic gel simulating human tissue. Penetration depth, over 8 inches. That's a lethal wound to any part of the torso, any part of the limbs, instant incapacitation or death. The helmet tests were even more dramatic. Period-accurate helmets rated to stop sword strikes. Helmets that archaeological evidence proved saved lives in actual medieval combat. The Dane axe fractured them. The steel deformed. The interior padding compressed. The force transmitted to the skull model inside would have caused fatal trauma even without penetration. One swing, one kill, just like the sagas claimed. The shield tests rendered medieval defensive tactics obsolete. A proper Viking-era shield could stop spears, could deflect swords, could save your life dozens of times. Against the Dane axe, 3 strikes and the shield split completely. The wood grain separated, the iron boss tore free. The shield became useless fragments, and that was against shields held by stationary test frames. In actual combat with the hooking technique, shields became liabilities within seconds. Modern HEMA practitioners, historical European martial arts experts, have rediscovered Dane axe techniques from fragmentary medieval sources. They've reconstructed the fighting style through experimentation and sparring. Their conclusion? The Dane axe might be the most effective medieval melee weapon ever designed. In controlled sparring with padded weapons, Dane axe users consistently defeat sword users. The reach advantage is insurmountable. The hooking technique is exactly as effective as Chronicles described. The versatility allows adaptation to any situation. One HEMA instructor in Denmark put it simply: fighting someone skilled with a Dane axe feels unfair. You can't get close. You can't defend properly. Your only option is hope they make a mistake. That's not modern bias. That's rediscovered reality. Military historians now recognise what medieval chroniclers knew. The Viking Age happened partly because of ships, partly because of navigation, partly because of culture and desperation, but also because Vikings had a weapon that gave them battlefield superiority. The Dane axe turned farmers into warriors, turned raiders into conquerors, turned Scandinavia into a power that reshaped European civilization. The Vikings weren't just raiders, they were engineers of death. They understood physics before physics was formalized. They understood leverage, momentum, and force multiplication through intuition and experimentation. They created a weapon so effective that it had to be culturally destroyed because it couldn't be militarily defeated. And the Dane axe, it was their masterpiece. A perfect marriage of simple materials and devastating design. Wood and steel transformed into controlled violence. The weapon didn't fail. Society changed around it. Politics and religion conspired to erase it, but the physics remain, the principles remain, the truth remains. In the hands of a trained warrior, the Dane axe was perhaps the deadliest personal weapon of the medieval period. Not the most famous, not the most romanticised, but the most effective, the most feared, the most Viking. History tried to forget it, but the evidence won't let us. Every fractured skull in Viking Age graves tells the story. Every medieval law banning it confirms its power. Every modern test validates what the chronicles claimed. The Dane axe was banned not because it was dishonourable, but because it was too deadly, too effective, too dangerous to the social order Europe was trying to build. And that might be the greatest compliment a weapon could ever receive.